Okay, class, I'm beginning to read. This is still Act 2, and this is starting on page 52. So there's nobody talking here. It's just stage directions in a very physical part of the performance. And the people that are performing are Annie and Helen. So let's begin, page 52. At the top of the page, James stalks out, much offended, and Kate, turning, stares across the yard at the house. The lights are narrowing down to the following pantomime in the family room, leave her motionless in the dark. Annie, meanwhile, has begun by slapping both keys down on the shelf out of Helen's reach. She returns to the table upstage. Helen's kicking has subsided, and when from the floor her hand finds Annie's chair empty, she pauses. Annie clears the table of Kate's, James, and Keller's plates. She gets back to her own across the table just in time to slide it deftly away from Helen's pouncing hand. Pounce like a tiger. She lifts the hand and moves it to Helen's plate, and after an instant's exploration, Helen sits again on the floor and drums her heels. Annie comes around the table and resumes her chair. When Helen feels her skirt again, she ceases kicking, waits for whatever is to come, renews some kicking, waits again. Annie, retrieving her plate, takes up a forkful of food, stops it halfway to her mouth, gazes at it, devoid of appetite, and half lowers it. But after a look at Helen, she sighs, dips the forkful towards Helen in a for your not sake toast, and puts it in her own mouth to chew, not without an effort. Helen now gets hold of the chair leg and half succeeds in pulling the chair out from under her. Annie bangs it down with her rear heavily and sits with all her weight. Remember, she's doing this so Helen can feel the movement. Helen next attempts to topple it is unavailing, so her fingers dive in a pitch at Annie's flank. Annie's flank is her butt. Annie, in the middle of her mouthful, almost loses it with startle, and she slaps the middle of her mouthful, almost loses it with startle, and she slaps down her fork to round on Helen. So that means she's going to go turn on Helen. The child comes up with curiosity to feel what Annie is doing. So Annie resumes eating, letting Helen's hand follow the movement of her fork to her mouth, whereupon Helen at once reaches into Annie's plate. Annie firmly removes her hand to her own plate. Helen, in reply, pinches Annie's thigh. A good, meaningful pinch that makes Annie jump. Annie sets the fork down and sits with her mouth tight. Helen digs another pinch in her thigh, and this time Annie slaps her hand smartly away. Helen retaliates with a roundhouse fist that catches Annie on the ear, and Annie's hands leap at once into a forceful slap across Helen's cheek. So here Annie actually hits Helen on the cheek. Helen is the startled one now. Annie's hand, in compunction, falters to her own face, but when Helen hits her again, Annie deliberately slaps her again. Helen lifts her fist in resolute for another roundhouse. Roundhouse. Annie lifts her hand resolute for another slap, and they freeze in this posture, while Helen mulls it over, thinks it over. Mulls means to think it over. She thinks better of it, drops her fist, and giving Annie a wide berth, gropes around to her mother's chair to find it empty. She plunders her way along the table upstage, and encountering the empty chairs and missing plate, she looks bewildered, questions. She gropes back to her mother's chair, again touches her cheek and indicates the chair, and waits for the world to answer. Annie now reaches over to spell into Helen, but Helen yanks it away. She gropes to the front door, tries the knob, and finds the door is locked with no key. She gropes to the rear door and finds it locked with no key. She commences to bang on it. Annie rises, crosses, takes her wrist, draws her resisting back to the table, sits her, and releases her hands upon her plate, as Annie herself begins to sit. Helen rises out of her chair, runs to the front door, and tugs and kicks at it. Annie rises again, crosses, draws her by one wrist back to the table, sets her, and sits Helen and sits. Helen escapes back to the door, knocking over her mother's chair en route. Annie rises again in pursuit, and this time lifts Helen bodily from behind and bears her, kicking and screaming. So she's carrying her while Helen is kicking and screaming. To her chair. She deposits her and once more turns to sit. Helen scrambles out, but as she passes, Annie catches her up again from behind and puts her in the chair. Helen scrambles out on the other side for the rear door, but Annie, at her heels, catches her up and deposits her again in the chair. She stands behind it. Helen scrambles out to the right, and the instant her feet hit the floor, Annie lifts and deposits her back, puts her back. She scrambles out to the left and at once is deposited back. She tries right again and is deposited back. She tries left again and is deposited back. And now faints. Means kind of gives up. Annie, to the right, but is off to her left, is promptly deposited back. She sits a moment and then starts straight over the tabletop, dishware notwithstanding. Annie hauls her in and deposits her back, with her plate slipping in her lap. She melts to the floor and crawls under the table, laborious among its legs and chairs, but Annie is swift under the table and waiting on the other side, where she surfaces, immediately bearing her aloft. So again, Annie is picking her up and carrying her. Helen clutches at James' chair for anchorage, but it comes with her, and halfway back she abandons it to the floor. Annie deposits her in her chair and waits. Helen sits tense, motionless, without movement. Then she tentatively puts on her left foot and hand. Annie interdisposes her own hand, and at the contact, Helen jerks hers in. She tries her right foot. Annie blocks it with her own. Helen jerks hers in. Finally, leaning back, she slumps down in the chair in a sullen bidding. Annie backs off a step and watches Helen, offers no move. Annie takes a deep breath. Both of them and the room are in considerable disorder. 2 chairs down on the table, a mess, but Annie makes no effort to tidy it. She only sits on her own chair and lets her energy refill. Then she takes up knife and fork and resolutely addresses her food. Helen's hand comes out to explore, and see it, Annie sits without moving. The child's hands go over her hand and fork, pauses, and he still does not move. and withdraws. Presently, it moves from her own plate, slaps about for it, and stops, thwarted. That means prevented. At this time, Annie again rises, recovers Helen's plate from the floor and a handful of scattered food from the deranged tablecloth, drops it on the plate, and pushes the plate into contact with Helen's fist. Neither of them now moves for a pregnant moment, until Helen suddenly takes a grab of food and wolfs it down. Annie permit herself the humor of a minor bow and warming of her hands together. She wanders off a step or two, watching Helen cleans up the plate. After a glower of indecision, she holds the empty plate out for more. Annie accepts it, and crossing to the removed plate, spoons food from them onto it. She stands debating the spoon, tapping it a few more times on Helen's plate. And when she returns with the plate, she brings the spoon too. She puts the spoon first in Helen's hand. Then she sets the plate down. Helen, discarding the spoon, that means throwing it away, reaches with her hand, and Annie stops it by the wrist. She replaces the spoon in it. Helen impatiently discards it again, and Annie stops her hand to replace the spoon in it. This time, Helen throws the spoon on the floor. Annie, after considering it, lifts Helen's bodily out of the chair, and in a wrestling match on the floor, closes her fingers upon the spoon and returns her with it to the chair. So now you have Helen and Annie on the floor wrestling together. Helen again throws the spoon on the floor. Annie lifts her out of the chair again, but in the struggle over the spoon, with Annie at her back, sends her sliding over her head. Helen flees back to the chair and scrambles into it. When Annie comes after her, she clutches it for dear life. Annie pries one hand loose, then the other, then the fist again, then the other again, and lifts Helen by the waist, chair and all, and shakes the chair loose. Helen wrestles to get free, but Annie pins her to the floor, closes her fingers upon the spoon, and lifts her kicking under one arm. With the other hand, she gets the chair in place again and plunks Helen back on it, where she releases her hand. Helen throws the spoon at her. Annie now removes the plate of food. Annie, grabbing, finds it missing and commences to bang with her fist on the table. Annie collects a fistful of spoons and descends with them and the plate on Helen. She let her smell the plate, at which Helen ceases banging. That means stops banging. And Annie puts the plate down and a spoon in Helen's hand. Helen throws it on the floor. Annie puts another spoon in her hand. Helen throws it on the floor. Annie puts another spoon in her hand. Helen throws it on the floor. When Annie comes back to her last spoon, she sits next to Helen and, gripping the spoon in Helen's hand, compels her to take food in it up to her mouth. Helen sits with lips shut. Annie waits a stolid moment, then lowers Helen's hand. She tries again. This time, Helen suddenly opens the mouth and accepts the food. Annie lowers the spoon with a sigh of relief, and Helen spews the mouth at her face. Annie sits a moment with eyes closed, then takes a pitcher and dashes the water in Helen's face, who gasps, astonished. Annie, with Helen's hand, takes up another spoonful and shoves it into her open mouth. Helen